Welcome everybody. My name is Anthony Shostak. I'm the education curator here at the Bates College Museum of Art. And to do the official welcome, I'm going to turn things over to our director, Dan Mills.
Hi, greetings and welcome to this evening's panel, everyone. I'm Dan Mills, as Anthony said, director of the Museum of Art. Welcome. We're so pleased that you've joined us for this evening's lively ceramics panel discussion with our distinguished guests, organized in conjunction with the fabulous An Adventurous Spirit, the Jane Costello Wellehan Collection exhibition. Before turning this back to Anthony Shostak, education curator, and Caitlin Patton, our assistant education curator of academic and community programs, I've got a few announcements. First, as you may know, Bates and therefore the Museum of Art are currently only open to Bates students and those with an ID. We sincerely hope this will change soon, and we'll let the public know via the webpage, social media, and the Museum of Art News. If you want to be notified directly when we reopen and don't already receive the news, you may sign up by going to our web front page. There's a button on the bottom of the page and just follow it through. So upcoming, mark your calendars for several other wonderful virtual programming events. Tomorrow, Friday, January 28th at 6 p.m., Leslie Dill is giving an artist talk in conjunction with the opening of her amazing exhibition, Wilderness, Light Sizzles Around Me. Thursday, February 10th at 6 p.m., the museum is presenting a painting panel with Lyndon Frederick. Let's see now if I was going to do this. So bear with me. Here is a preview of the Leslie Dill exhibition. And when I say preview, if you look really closely, you might be able to see a hydraulic lift, an orange hydraulic lift, almost hiding behind one of the walls, but just to give you a little bit of a sense of the amazing exhibition upstairs. So this isn't the view I wanted, but this is Zoomland. So if you can accept the white lines, thank you very much. So the painting panel on February 10th at 6 p.m. In this order, left to right, is Lyndon Frederick, Alan Bray, and Daniel Minter, all three of whom are in the Jane Costello Wellehan Collection exhibition currently on view. Monday, February 14th at 6 p.m., we'll be having a screening of Ed Robbins' film Divide Light, which documents the experimental opera created through collaboration between originator and creator Leslie Dill and composer Richard Marriott. Divide Light examines the nature of emotion and storytelling in contemporary society through the lens of Emily Dickinson's 19th century philosophical poetics. The screening will be followed by a discussion with this award-winning director and digital journalist. The Costello exhibition programming is generously funded through the Jane Costello Wellehan Endowment, and the Leslie Dill programming is generously funded through the Friends of the Museum of Art and the Synergy Fund. For more on these events and other activities in the museum, please visit bates.edu/museum. And now I turn this over to Anthony Shostak.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you all in our audience for joining us this evening. Before I introduce our guests, I'll just share a word about our format tonight. Each of our panelists will give a short presentation to better acquaint you with their work, and then we'll start a discussion. If this were in person, throughout that discussion, we would invite you to raise your hand and ask questions rather than wait until the end of the conversation and have a Q&A. We think it's a lot more fun to have people ask questions throughout and have the conversation be a lot more lively that way. Because this is Zoom, we can't see your hands, but we do have a handy Q&A function. I invite you to look at the bottom of your screen. There should be a Q&A button. And if you use that, you can type in questions for the panel. Caitlin will help me keep an eye on those, and we can pose those to the panelists. And if you see a question that you think is especially cool or very similar to a question you have, you can upvote that, and that will bump it up toward the top of the list and give us a sense that, yeah, like 8 people really want to see this one answered. So I would invite you all to do that. And if I'll just point out that we are recording tonight. If you know someone who could not tune in with us this evening, please let them know that our event will be recorded and available through the museum's website sometime in the next week. That will depend a little bit on our support staff and how quickly they can get that turned around once we get the file from Zoom. Since we do have a few people who have joined us since the very beginning, I am sorry to have to report that Ayumi Horie, who is going to be our first panelist this evening, has had a serious issue arise that requires her immediate attention, and she sends her regrets to tonight's audience and her co-presenters and asks for your understanding. So that brings us to Mark Johnson. Mark Johnson is currently Professor of Ceramics and Foundation at the Maine College of Art. He received his BFA and MFA degrees from Kent State University. His ceramic work explores the relationship between control and chance that is an important part of the soda firing process. Pottery forms, including vases, jars, teapots, platters, and pouring vessels, are surfaced with glazes that interact with the clay body and the soda kiln atmosphere to create a synthesis of material, form, and process. His artwork has been featured in numerous books and periodicals and has been included in over 200 exhibitions in galleries and museums throughout the United States. He has been an artist in residence at the Archie Bray Foundation, Helena, Montana, and at the Watershed Center for Ceramic Art here in Newcastle, Maine. Mark has received an individual artist fellowship from the Maine Arts Commission and the New England Foundation for the Arts, NEA. So please join me in welcoming Mark Johnson, who I will invite to share your screen.
Thank you, Anthony. Glad to be here. Can you see my screen okay?
We're good.
Can you hear me all right?
Absolutely.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. Thank you. If you have any trouble, just give me a heads up, okay? Because I can just see my screen. That's about it. And oops. So I can just give you my selection of work today is just a little summary of the kinds of things that I make. Pretty typical for me to move between forms. So the first form here is I sometimes call these long platters. They're made in a press mold and they're soda fired. And I'm looking at kind of hidden geometries and kind of finding ways to change and individualize each piece because they come out looking pretty similar when I press the clay into the mold. And so I like to kind of give them some personality by maybe designing the surface in different ways. This is another piece from a slightly different mold. And I have a kind of palette of glazes that are both warm and cool. And I try to mix that up, you know, to create some drama and design issues. I also make a series of bowls. They're probably some of the more straightforward things that I make. These are made on the potter's wheel. But I'm also looking again at surface geometries and ways of kind of cutting the form up with shape and then reassembling it. Thinking about warm and cool color relationships, kind of that old 2D design stuff, you know, trying to find a use for that. In my work, functionalism is important. So when I make something like a bowl or a basket like this is, you know, it should hold something, should do a good job of doing it. If I make a pouring vessel or a teapot, it should pour. But I'm also interested in beyond that and want my work to speak to issues that I think are important in terms of contemporary ceramics, you know, kind of updating tradition, and looking for ways to keep excited and enthusiastic about the process. So I probably spend more time glazing than I do actually making. For me, that's kind of just my nature. It seems like I'm slower these days at it. It takes me longer. And so it's just like that's my you know, one of the things I deal with is that notion of balancing. You know, what time I put into what part of the process, but glazing is definitely takes me quite a while. This is a pouring vessel, and one of the requirements is that it has to be able to work. It has to do its job. It has to feel good in your hands. It has to be light enough to pick up when it's loaded with water or wine or whatever you might use it for. And it has to pour a very even water flow. So not only aesthetics, but kind of usefulness are kind of going hand in hand with me. These are all soda fired to this point. So the soda kiln adds a little flavor to the clay body. I leave some of the clay body open so that it will change color as in the firing. So I like to think of all the steps in the process, adding some kind of creative component. So when I throw, I usually distort my forms or alter them in some way, knock them off round, ovalize them or dart them, combine forms, so that very few of my pieces, except maybe for that bowl in the very beginning, are thrown in one piece. This might have like 6 or 8 pieces involved in the making process. So it becomes a little bit more elaborate. I look at body forms, you know, shoulders, feet as kind of references to the human form. So it sort of feels like a puffed up kind of figure to me, a little bit with volume. My teapots are also required to work. Again, like I make sure that they pour really well, but I'm also interested in maybe looking for ways of dividing or kind of partitioning the form a little bit in kind of more challenging ways that might kind of be not what you might expect, maybe to break up some of the symmetry, but also allow the clay body to breathe through and accept some of the color from the process of soda firing, which can add some really beautiful mark making on the surface. And I also pick glazes that respond very well to that. So these are additional couple of other teapots. So what I like to do is put some glazes on my work that are very stiff, that don't respond to the soda glaze. They hold their turf, they don't run. And then I'll use other glazes that run a lot and kind of try to mix and match those together so that I have some things that are fixed and some things that are changing. So I like that whole kind of working with the process with my work. I also make vase forms. So these would hold flowers. This is about maybe 14 inches tall. Again, kind of some of the same issues that I've been talking about before. I look at a lot of history, a lot of historical pottery, and love kind of the history of ceramics, but I don't want to copy that work. I want to just be impressed with it and be inspired by it and try to make some of those relationships my own. So I look at Chinese work, Islamic pottery, Korean pottery, as well as lots of other things. This is a little bit of a different kind of vase form. It's a little more slouchy, a little more slumpy. And my approach to the surface is a little bit more of a drawing kind of surface. And I teach design, so I'm always thinking, how do you deal with figure ground and positive negative space? And I remember as a student going through all that foundation work and not really knowing how to make use of it. And it really was quite a few years out of undergrad school that really started to click, and I could figure out like, oh yeah, I could sort of do that. Now I know what we were learning in those classes, and really seemed very abstract, so being able to apply it was a big discovery. These last few forms here are what I call flower raft forms. They're actually vases that allow you to put flowers in different openings, which can make for a really beautiful display on the table because they are a little bit more spread out, not just one place to put the flowers in. There are forms like this in Dutch ceramics called tulipiers. There's also Chinese versions. These are kind of my take on them. I see them as like little factories for flowers to sit in. They're like chimneys and smokestacks. I grew up in Cleveland, and when I grew up in Cleveland, it was a very industrial city, a very powerful industrial city. And so riding downtown on the trains, you went through what we called the flats and saw all these blast furnaces with chimneys and smokestacks. And it was a little scary because as a little kid, flame was shooting out of these things, but it was very impressive and left a memory kind of planted in me. So some of these have little echoes of those kind of combinations. Most recently, I've been kind of messing around in the studio a little bit with slip casting, which is a kind of very different kind of way of making ceramics. So you design a mold and then you pour in clay. Usually you pour in porcelain, but you can use other kinds of clay. I've chosen to use kind of a cone 6 porcelain, which is a kind of a mid-range. And I make all my prototypes out of clay. I make them solid and then I cut them up and then reassemble them. So I'm still kind of thinking about parts and how they fit together and using colors in a different way. They're kind of a much brighter palette. That's possible with this process in an electric kiln. It's not quite the same as in the soda kiln, which tends to be more earth tones. This tends to be a little possibly more brighter. And I'm kind of intrigued by that possibility. I've also done some research in 3D printing. I haven't really made a mold of these yet, but these are some prototypes printed on a 3D printer. And I use this little program called Tinkercad, which is a fun, very accessible, very playful way to design in 3 dimensions modeling. And it's also very, it's free. Anybody could sign up for a Tinkercad account. And so these are actually, I'll go back one slide. These are actually cup prototypes that I've been thinking about making. So I think that's it, except for this last slide that shows that I'm also a gardener and kind of looking for form wherever I can find an unruly bush to trim into a neat shape. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay, and I'll stop sharing, okay?
Yes, please. So our next panelist is Sequoia Miller, who is a curator, historian, and studio potter. Sequoia has a BA in Russian and art history from Brandeis University and a Master of Arts in Decorative Arts, Design History, and Material Culture from the Bard Graduate Center, and a PhD in the History of Art from Yale University. His thesis analyzed the connections between ceramics and conceptual art practices on the east and west coasts of the United States in the 1960s and 1970s. Sequoia curated the ceramic presence in modern art at the Yale University Art Gallery and authored the accompanying award-winning catalog. Before re-entering academia, he was a full-time studio potter for more than 10 years. Based in the Pacific Northwest, he made one-of-a-kind functional pots for daily use in domestic environments. Sequoia has exhibited widely and led workshops at craft schools, universities, and art centers in the United States and Canada. Please join me in welcoming Sequoia Miller.
Okay, thanks, Anthony, and thank you, Dan. Thanks, Mark. Delighted to be here. I kind of wish I was there in person, which was, of course, plan A, but here we are on Zoom, which is also fun. So wonderful to be sort of virtually within the Bates and in the Maine community. So let me start sharing my screen so that we can look at a few pictures while I talk. Let's see. So here is an image of one pot of mine with a few of the paintings actually that are in the Wellehan collection and now at the Bates Museum. I hadn't known about Jane Wellehan, but for me, it's really interesting to see this collection come into the museum from a spectrum of Maine artists, and especially a collection that integrates ceramics. So it seems like so fundamentally into her sort of vision for assembling her collection. So I am, as Anthony mentioned, a studio potter, curator, and an art historian. And many of you know that I grew up mostly in Maine. I think that the important part about me being from Maine in this context is a sort of generational link that I have to the community of artists that are represented in the collection. When I was a kid, I was part of the Maine art community through my mother, Sherry Miller. My mom is a painter, and when I was young, she dragged me to countless studios and life drawing classes, exhibitions, dinners with all of her artist friends, kind of everything. On one level, I knew that it was an unusual experience, but on another level, it was also just what life was and what Maine was like for me. So artists like Fred Lynch and Eric Hopkins, whose painting you see kind of in the center of this slide, and are again part of the collection and the exhibition, these were familiar figures to me growing up. They were familiar both as people and through artworks like these ones. Other painters like Della Vipkar, who made the painting with the cats and in the painting of the cats, artists like Della Vipkar and Abby Shawn, I knew more through their work and a little bit less personally, but would still encounter it in many kind of environments. When I was around 10 years old, my mom worked at Haystack for a few years, and we would go up to the campus periodically, where I got kind of a full dose of the sort of Haystack experience pretty early on. This introduced me to the broader arts community, including ceramic artists, potters, weavers, kind of the whole thing. And it also, in a way, I think, normalized craft as a part of studio art for me from a very early age. Around that time, I also took my first pottery classes with Toby Rosenberg, who at the time shared a studio with Paul Heroux, who will be familiar to many of you as the longtime ceramics faculty here at Bates. I continued taking classes with Toby for several years, and Toby has remained a teacher, a mentor, and a friend that I treasure into the present. So, hey, Toby. When we think about ceramics in this collection and in Maine, I guess the aspect that I would propose as unique or unusual is the proximity of ceramics and really craft media more broadly to painting and sculpture, which for me has been an important way to make, look at, and to think about art. Let me switch slides here. Most of my work in the Wellehan Collection is from about 2005 to 2010. At that time, I was a full-time studio potter. I was based in Olympia, Washington, where I lived for about 15 years. Starting in the late 1990s, I would have annual exhibitions at June Fitzpatrick's Gallery, first on High Street and then in the Maine College of Art building. For me, this was a great way to reconnect with Maine and to forge relationships really as an adult, not only as a kid. After those roughly 15 years of being a full-time potter, I changed track in 2010 and moved back to New York City, where I was born. I moved there to pursue the master's degree in decorative arts, design, history, and material culture, mainly because I found that there were questions that I was not getting at through my studio work. Questions that were research-based, that were historical and theoretical in nature. In 2 years, I earned my master's, and I found that I still hadn't kind of figured out those questions. So that's when I went on to earn the PhD in art history. As Anthony mentioned, when I was in the doctoral program at Yale, I had the opportunity to curate a major exhibition at the art gallery. The premise of the show was that it could be productive to look at ceramics not only as a distinct field of endeavor, but also within the broader context of modern and contemporary art. So in the exhibition, we put together groupings like Toshiko Takayasu, who you see in the image on the left. She made the ceramic forms on the floor. We kind of paired her with artists like Robert Motherwell and Mark Rothko, who have these very large abstract expressionist paintings on the wall. Similarly, in the image on the right, you can see ceramics by Lucy Ree and Hans Koper, two real heroes of the 20th century ceramics world, paired with Agnes Martin, who has a series of prints on the wall. And on the opposite wall, out of view in the image, was a wall drawing by Saul LeWitt. I think one reason why this whole premise made sense to me was because, in part, of my upbringing in Maine, where there was, in fact, and probably still is, a kind of permeable boundary, an interchange between ceramics and other media. I'm now Chief Curator and Deputy Director at the Gardner Museum in Toronto, a small museum that specializes in ceramic art. Our collection has both historical material, mostly European and East Asian, as well as a modern and contemporary collection with an emphasis on Canadian artists. The images that you're seeing here on the right show on the top our European porcelain gallery, which includes this kind of dramatic table setting, kind of dessert service from an aristocratic table in the late 18th century. And we're also seeing on the image with the orange, a picture of our Japanese porcelain gallery, which includes works from Japan, mostly from the 17th century, as well as European works that were influenced by those kind of first pieces coming from Japan into Europe. The image on the lower left is of a space in the museum called, part of a space called the Courtois Gallery, which is kind of in the staircase of the museum, and has these individual cases and vitrines. And I wanted to include this image because it has historical and contemporary works together, which I think is really one of the most exciting parts about working at the Gardner for me. So in the lower left of that image, with the kind of pots in it, maybe if you can see my cursor on the lower left here, there's a pot by Christopher Dresser, a well-known Victorian designer from England. Here we have pieces by Richard Millette, a well-known Canadian kind of conceptual artist who uses clay, alongside a Royal Worcester vase from the early 19th century. And it's, in fact, these combinations that I find so interesting and so dynamic as ways of looking at and thinking about, again, both ceramics, but also this broader world and way of thinking. Lately at the Gardner, I have been preparing an exhibition by a Canadian artist named Sherry Boyle. The exhibition is called Outside the Palace of Me, and it takes the structure of theater and kind of the sideshow to investigate ways that we construct and perform our identities, both for ourselves and for each other. The image on the right is the near sort of the entrance of the exhibition, where as the viewer, you find yourself emerge onto the stage as a performer of sorts. Rather than being a spectator, you're kind of placed in this position as an active participant. As you go through the exhibition, you start to see how these questions of identity and self-perception are intimately tied to legacies of racism, sexism, colonialism, misogyny, and other issues and inequalities that we struggle with as a society. Maybe you can get a sense from these images how actually kind of visually rich the show is, as well as being very dense in its material and its questions and themes that it raises. As a project, it points to really the center of what I feel is our work now in museums generally, and at the Gardner in particular. And that's to address and explore and investigate some of the historic biases and inequities that we live with in our society. There's broad questions and really fundamental issues with kind of what museums are and who they're for and how they function and how they're funded. So exhibitions like this for me are a way to really help support the work of phenomenal Canadian artists, while also really engaging audiences with some very substantive questions, and while also really thinking about what the role of the museum is in society. So if you can, come to Toronto before the end of the spring, and we can see the Sherry Boyle show. I will stop sharing my screen and say thanks again.
Well, great. Thank you both for giving us a quick look at your careers and the works that you're doing both in the studio and on the museum floor. So again, I'll reiterate to our audience that we would love for questions to come to you guys. I have a number of prepared questions, but if we can ask yours, it'll be a lot more fun, I think. But I will begin with one of my questions, which comes to us through our ceramics program here at Bates College. And that is, given that ceramics is a craft with a very long history, what are your thoughts on the interplay between tradition and innovation in your own work or in the subject of your research interests? Do either of you want to, does that resonate with one of you more than the other, or do I put one of you on the spot?
Let's start with Mark because he's making things.
There we go.
Okay. Well, I think it's a really good question because as a maker and a teacher, I think we're always aware, I'm always aware of that. And I think it's an interesting question these days with the notion of appropriation, and cultural appropriation being a difficult topic that was not as really broached when I was a student myself. So I think finding your own voice is both a challenge and a very interesting proposition. So for me personally, I like to bounce off of tradition, but I want to make that work my own and respond to what I feel are the challenges of a visual artist, trying to organize things and try to organize the elements of design, try to come up with new solutions, try to update forms that might be familiar, but try to make them my own so that they're not something that's just repeated historically. And I think as a teacher, that's a really interesting challenge also, to try to let students find their voice, show them things that are out there, but ask them that challenging question about how do they add something to a media that is that old. But I think it's not unusual. I mean, painters have they have a deep history. They have things they have to bounce off of also. So I think it's a very good question. I think something, especially in education, we're aware of constantly now.
Sequoia, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, sure. I would say that for me, when I think about balancing tradition and innovation, it's really I guess from the position I'm working now as a curator and a historian, it's really about history. It's really about thinking, how do we sort of struggle and work with the past and understand it. It seems to me that history is always a reflection of the present, right? It's always sort of answering or looking into present needs and present questions. And so in that way, however we look at history or however we create it, it's always in the present. So it's always this mix of innovation and tradition, or it's always this mix of kind of current questions and reframing how we understand the past. So like in that very small example I showed of the Richard Millet and the Royal Worcester piece together, this is like an artist who's really taking history apart and using it to ask questions. And that is one area where ceramics is so rich, as Mark was saying. And of course, not unlike other media where, artists are constantly kind of incorporating clues or sort of thoughts or reflections on the history of their medium. I think one thing that's different with ceramics, though, is that so many of us throughout history have lived with ceramics in our daily lives, that when we see like a bowl, for example, or a vase or an urn, or kind of so many ceramic objects are these sort of fundamental human kind of survival devices, these kind of things that we live with that sustain us, that they have this sort of really deep resonance. So in a way that's has an upside and a downside. The downside is that you kind of can't get away from those associations. You can't just evacuate yourself from ceramic history. You're always in relationship to it, I think. On the other hand, it's this like amazing, incredible set of associations and meanings that we can riff off of.
Great. Mark, one of our guests asks, how do you include topics of cultural appropriation in your teaching?
Well, I think it's a very, like, again, it's a very important discussion, and trying to be sensitive to the notion that being aware of what has been made in other cultures, but not try to duplicate that. You don't have to copy it to honor it. You can respond to it and like it without having to appropriate it directly into your work. And so you can learn an awful lot by looking at how things are balanced, how things are crafted, the attention to surface. That kind of passion for doing things can be an influence as much as, let's say, the actual object itself. So there's lots of ways to actually glean and take inspiration from objects without literally having to take that, and copy it, which was actually a way to learn not that long ago in art schools. And I think that's been, an important discussion. I don't know if that answered the question more, but it's something we're talking about constantly. And if students, bring things in, and say, well, are you, to sensitize them to maybe think about this, without trying to shame them, because I think their initial response is they want to honor something, but say, well, is there another way to do that? Is there a way to learn from that piece other than to copy it directly? I don't know if Sequoia has any thoughts on that issue or not, being kind of from the curatorial side of looking at history and like kind of programming for maybe even like people coming in to see, from the public, how that might affect your discussion at all about how you present the work.
Yeah, for sure. It impacts, absolutely. Yeah, it impacts what we would call interpretation. So the didactic or kind of the text-based materials in an installation. It's a complicated subject, obviously, like Mark was indicating, and there's no one, it's not static. Like there's no one way of thinking. There's no one kind of sort of set of practices, let's say, that's stable. So I'm thinking of that Christopher Dresser piece that I flagged, and noticed, part of what made Christopher Dresser famous was that he took Japanese. He was one of the few British designers to travel to Japan in the 1870s, and he kind of took Japanese design elements and adapted them into British design language. He wasn't the first one. He certainly wasn't the only one, but he absolutely popularized it. And so how do we think about that now? How do we understand that now? And I think that at a minimum, we can add a critical lens to that that set of relationships, or that kind of lifting. Doesn't mean we have to, I don't think it means we have to, evacuate the Christopher Dresser work from the museum or from the collection, but I do think it becomes a useful frame for thinking about, say, power dynamics in the 19th century between England and Japan, or between the West and Japan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. I was just looking at some prints from Mary Cassatt the other day, and the big recognition of Japanese design, print design, kind of in that era, and how one culture has infused, how things are seen and what is considered to be new, a new way of seeing, and it's a constant flow back and forth through lots of cultures. So it is a very interesting topic.
I'm going to expand a little bit on a question from one of our museum interns who's working with us this semester, who wants to know a little bit about how one's research in one field, such as academia, can influence your work in the studio. And I'm going to flip that around and so that Mark can answer it as well, how your work in the studio might lead you to be researching things that you might not have thought would be areas of interest a year or two ago.
Well, I think that's a good question. I think one of the things that I try to do as a teacher is to try to find out what students are interested in besides the art world, because the art world is one way to be influenced, and again, we've talked about some of maybe the pitfalls of relying too much on looking at, historical models. Like the world is a very big place. And so there's lots of non-art objects that you can look at for inspiration to kind of help you understand maybe your place in the world. You might look at architecture, you might look at landscape, you might look at natural objects. You can look at lots of things that aren't made by humans for a sense of inspiration, for surface and form. And if that makes sense, so that's what I do. I'm a gardener, so I tend to look at plants, but I also kind of look at the way the natural world grows, and it's a very organic process, and trying to think about maybe how you make things in an organic way, how things can develop, and how your ideas can grow, so you can kind of conceptually bring that notion into your work. I think people in ceramics especially are kind of tenders, like you have to kind of nurse things along. There are lots of lots of disasters can happen in the way. And I think it's a lot like being a gardener. You kind of coach your plants to kind of live, but ultimately they kind of have a life of their own. And I think if you create work kind of with that attitude that you still have to let it breathe and live, you can work your will on it, but you have to leave a place for it to actually develop itself. And I think that's where often in the firing process, that bit of mystery, a little bit of chance that enters into the process is a little bit like that for me.
Sequoia, how is your work in academia affect your studio? How does it find its way to informing your work with clay itself?
Yeah, for sure. It's a really complex question. And I think for me, it goes back and forth. So it's not sort of unidirectional, it's multi-directional. And in a way, I feel like there's more openness and more possibility. Not more possibility, but there's more flexibility maybe moving from a sort of research practice into a studio practice. Because in a way, in a studio practice, your accountability is very different. Let's say that Mark, for example, can take the inspiration from his gardening and kind of do whatever he wants with it in his studio practice. He doesn't owe anything to the plants in a way to represent them in one way or another. I think that for me, going in the other direction from the kind of studio work into academic research work, it's really about creativity actually and openness. I think that there's a way to approach research that feels very task oriented and more like you're finding something out rather than creating something. And as I said at the beginning, I do feel like history is something that we create, it's something we generate for our own needs. So as a researcher, as a scholar, as an academic, for me, it's a fundamentally generative act. It's a creative act of invention. And so in that sense, it's very much like a studio practice. I think the real distinction, though, has to do with this question of accountability. And I think that when you're working in a historical or an academic or a kind of scholarly model, you have greater accountability to the sources. And when you're working in a studio-based practice, it's kind of like fiction or nonfiction, not 100% separated from each other. There's definitely overlap. But when you're in a studio practice, you can kind of like, if I'm making something in response to Christopher Dresser, I can do whatever I want. If I'm, writing an article about Christopher Dresser that I'm presenting as a research article or as a scholarly article, then I'm accountable a little bit more to fact and to history and to what I create out of that.
That's great. So here's another question from our ceramics program. And I think we've been talking about this sort of in roundabout ways all night long so far, but to sort of hit it head on, what are some of the layers of meaning or content handmade pots may have that go beyond mere utility?
Well, I think the notion that you interact with them with your hand as well as your eye is part of the learning process and part of the richness of ceramics. I mean, ceramics is a really broad medium. I mean, when I'm teaching, I have students who are doing figurative sculpture that has nothing to do with function. And I have students that are doing, installation work, and that has nothing to do with function. So it's a very broad medium. In my particular interest in my own work, I tend to work with a vessel just because I feel like it's a topic that I can wrap my head around, and there's enough interest there for me to find a career and a lifetime kind of exploring. But I appreciate and understand that ceramics is way broader than the vessel. There are lots of legs to the ceramic medium. And for me as an instructor and a lifelong clay person, I appreciate that and actually love that variety. So I love going to shows as Sequoia is presenting, that actually where the curator is creatively maybe putting together what we call juxtaposition. They're putting together maybe pieces that kind of talk to each other across the room or across the wall. And I feel challenged by that. And I feel like that's the strength of the clay world right now. It can also be confusing for people because there isn't really a one size fits all answer, but I actually kind of like that. that there are many people working in clay in many different ways. Maybe I'm going a little off topic, from that question. I hope not, but in that sense, like for me, my work is, I'm making it about function and other things, but I appreciate work that's not about function whatsoever and really enjoy, that as well. So I don't feel like I only look at one thing.
I'll jump in to say that I think that, utility, so mere utility is a tricky phrase because it sort of suggests that utility is that it has this kind of like base aspect to it, I suppose, that it has a sort of obviousness maybe, whereas I think it does have this kind of sense of speaking to the kind of the human condition on a really fundamental level, a bit like I suggested earlier on, this notion of pots sort of resonating at this really, really deep kind of way of being human, that they sustain us, and we associate them, I think, sometimes consciously, sometimes less so, with this sustenance. Or sort of the ability to maintain our kind of presence on the planet, let's say. I do feel like clay for a long time has, sort of been hampered by having these very, very deep sort of sticky associations, is almost how I think of them. They're kind of like these symbolic or metaphorical meanings that we kind of can't get away from in clay. And I do feel like in the last pretty recent chunk of time, maybe 5 or 10 years, these sort of sticky metaphorical associations have really transformed from being liabilities to being assets. So for years, this kind of, this weight, this kind of symbolic weight of ceramic as a medium kind of kept it encumbered in as an art form, because there were, I think, relatively fewer folks were able to see that as a positive, or to see that as a source of meaning in the work. And I think one of the reasons why so many artists are working in clay now, artists who don't sort of come up through the ceramic system or don't think of themselves as ceramic artists, why so many people are drawn to using clay is because it does have these very strong, very deep, and really global associations with what it means to be human on a kind of symbolic, fundamental level. And that now is this huge source of meaning for so many folks. And I feel like there's this almost latent literacy that we all have with ceramic, because we're using it. Like, Dan, you picked up your mug to have a drink of whatever you're drinking, and like, you're using ceramic, you're touching ceramic to your lip. And this is something that we do, every day, that so many people, vast majority of people, touch ceramic every day. So I think that's kind of why it's so exciting that there is this kind of pretty hefty symbolic weight that's become a real asset and source of exploration for folks.
Yeah, I think that ceramics are a way to, if you have handmade teacups in your house and you use them, it's a way to have an aesthetic experience, every day. It becomes a ritual if you drink your tea or coffee habitually, as I do. That just becomes this lovely thing. You find this cup that really just feels right for you. It's your cup. You don't let your kids use it or whatever. And it's a kind of a wonderful thing to have this. Someone made this. There's a conscious idea that it's connected to an individual person as opposed to a factory. And it feels great in your hand, and you like the way, it fits your mouth just right. So I think that that's absolutely spot on. So here's another question. And Mark, you talked a little bit about this as you were introducing your work at the very beginning. But the students in the ceramic program are very interested in, if you could talk, each of you could talk a little bit about the interplay between the moving from working with the form and then working with doing things to its surface with glaze, how you shift your focus from one to the other.
But it is a pretty big dichotomy, and I think that's one of the real challenges and one of the big frustrations. But maybe Sequoia, I have, so like I said, I was looking at one of his pieces on the shelf, and I'm curious if that, I know that was a big consideration in your work, and one of the things I really always enjoyed about your work was the relationship of form and surface. And I don't know if you want to go first, maybe, and I'll follow up. How's that?
Yeah, sure. That sounds great. So when you were introducing your work, you used this great phrase of hidden geometries, which I think is so good. And I wish that I had thought of that when I was making ceramics, because it really, like, that's a great way to think of how, you know, different approaches or treatments to the surface can affect our perception of form. And it does really can reveal these different aspects of it. So yeah, it was a big concern for me, particularly because so many of my pots were not round, that they had a sort of architectural or kind of structural aspect by having sides and planes. It sets up a different kind of rhythm, something that you can respond to. There's a beginning, sort of sets up a narrative in a different way. There's a beginning, middle, and end rather than a continuous, something continuous. I think that, not to harp on the historical part of it, but part of the way that ceramic has kind of functioned as an artistic medium historically, I think has been in relation to this form and surface question, because in the West, sort of the traditional definition of sculpture was that it wasn't painted, right? The sort of academic definitions of fine art in Europe were really premised on sculpture, on a sculptural medium on sculpture as a medium that did not include a painted surface. So it would be marble or bronze were the two principal media. And anything that was painted was seen as like folk or sort of odd or less than or whatever. And it's really only in the last, 100 years, 120 years, but even especially in the last like 50 years, that painted sculpture is something that, people who think of themselves as being interested in art can kind of wrap their heads around. So in the image of the ceramic presence installation that I showed with the Lucy Ree and the Agnes Martin, there was a David Smith kind of lurking in the background. And he's a well-known kind of modernist sculptor from the post-war American, post-World War II. And actually the work in that image was painted. And it was like a huge issue that a guy in, 1962 would like paint a sculpture. It was like, that was a controversy. And so in a way, audiences weren't even able to like kind of conceive of ceramic because it had this interplay. And so I see it as fundamental to the medium and super interesting and fun.
Yeah, exactly. I like to think of in that relationship of clay as a hybrid medium between 2D and 3D where they meet. And I think it's a really big challenge because as Sequoia is saying, in 3D design classes, you're usually taught about just worry about the form, don't worry about the surface. And it kind of, that sort of still alive. And I think that ceramics, you really can't think about it without that surface. You're kind of forced into it by your teacher usually. What are you going to do to glaze that? What are you going to do to fire that? How are you going to finish that? You know what I mean? That's what I was asking that. Where sculpture is a question. So it's part of our heritage, but I also think it's part of our great opportunity to try and find ways to cope and deal with that. And we're such a material-based medium that we're kind of also not a hybrid only between 2D and 3D. We're kind of a hybrid between science and art, where the science of glaze chemistry and formulation and all those things, the materials, we painters don't make their own paint, but potters and sculptors often make their own glazes and surfaces. So we're kind of really very material based. So we're always thinking of that question about surface in our work. And I tend to, again, try to activate that surface in interesting ways and challenge ways that might be a little different maybe than things have been done historically.
So that's kind of a neat segue into this question, which is how has our inexorable shift from a computer-based digital world changed the field of ceramics?
That's a big one. Maybe I'll start with that one since Mark just went. Like obviously everything, like there's so many answers to that question. We could kind of have a whole panel on that question in a way. I think that the big ones from my perspective are access to history, actually access to information. So it's, online museum collections, and that any kind of ceramic student can sort of Google any any work from anywhere and have some source images. Whereas, 50 years ago, there were like 3 books that were commonly circulating out of maybe 20 that existed on a given topic. So yeah, just access to images and collections, huge. The other huge thing is, of course, how people present their own work that they're making now. And Instagram as a format for kind of presenting yourself and your artwork. It's like has sort of rules about it. Like some things look better on Instagram than others, and it has to do with silhouette, has to do with color, has to do with a certain kind of framing and a certain kind of pop. So there's a really different kind of way, I think, that we are all kind of embedding the way that we see, or the way that we see is shifting as a result of this. So I guess those are the 2 big ones for me.
Yeah, I think it's also revolutionized how artists sell their work in a good way. I mean, galleries were really important, but not so much now. I mean, people just directly go to a market, and students are always telling me about work they've bought or what they've sold, on Instagram. I think it's great. I think it's much more direct. I think it has led to more communication and sharing. I think actually I'm amazed how sharing people are about their process and what they're doing, what they're interested in. And across not just the United States, but even all over the world. So it's actually really broadened access to information visually, and also just kind of getting a network of people to share your thoughts and ask questions. I also think it's potentially an interesting way to design work using programs, 3D modeling. So I've done a little bit of it, just basic stuff. I can see where it's very interesting. I'm not sure that I can incorporate it totally into my work, but I appreciate it and have tried it, and I'm kind of fascinated by it as well. So it actually, in the physical making, as well as the kind of visual presence that it has, in social media, that there are people who are exploring those avenues about using digital processes, 3D printing or clay printing, to kind of laser cutting, ways to kind of use that new technology in their work.
So that's kind of interesting, Mark. One of the questions that I had was had to deal with the interplay between planning and improvisation, because the clay is under your hands. It's sort of a live thing that might be doing things that unexpectedly that cause you to react to it. Do you think that that something might be lost or something else gained if that tactile element is taken away and a computer is just kind of printing out pre-designed ceramics?
Well, I think you're always the designer, so you're in charge of the process. So it won't print anything that you don't create. So I think that you can still be creative with that. And I've seen some really interesting stuff that's been digitally made, and some stuff that I find pretty boring and just kind of like a one-off. It's really kind of like, well, that looks like it's been 3D printed, and it's sort of like a very obvious thing, and beyond that, it's hard to go beyond that. It's like a novelty. But I do think there are the people, like in any avenue, who've used it creatively and kind of come up with some really interesting solutions. I think it's just another opportunity for people to use. And I appreciate that, because I think it's again broadening the media, and I don't think it necessarily takes away from handmade, because you're still going to have to deal with that once it comes out of that process. You can either surface it or glaze it or fire it. You've got to do something with it, so you're still going to interact with it. So I'm just kind of intrigued by it, actually.
Toby Rosenberg, I have not been super attentive to the chat, but he did just pop in a note asking, do you think there really is such a sharp transition between form and surface? Aren't you considering surface at least subconsciously as you form?
Oh yeah, for sure. So Toby is a she, just to clarify, but yeah, and that's part of what makes a sort of a long engagement with a particular medium so complex, actually, because you're thinking, at multiple levels all the time. And so you can't always break down. You're never just thinking about one thing. You're sort of addressing what happened in the last batch that you made, what you're thinking about for the future, sort of how it feels in your hand, all of these things. So yeah, I would say that they're deeply intertwined.
Right. I think that's true. I think it's really part of a continuum when you're creating your bodies of work. They're usually related somehow to what you've done before. And when you switch, that can be a big challenge because now you've got to come up with a whole new approach to maybe surface, which can be hard, because you get used to a particular way of you don't realize how used to you're looking at your work. And then when you change something, how that alters the outcome. Now, wow, I've got to kind of come up with a whole new way of dealing with that. I don't have that assumption anymore. I can't bounce off of that. I've got to come up with a new way. So that's always an ongoing challenge, never really solved.
And, I would also actually I think it's worth pointing out that in the same way that form and surface aren't, like an exclusive binary, that that sort of digital practice and non-digital practice aren't entirely separate from each other either. So I don't think there's a sense that, digital production methods or digital design is like sort of one thing and it exists on one channel, and then making things by hand, say, exists on another channel, or industrial production is its own thing. These are all overlapping and intersecting with each other. And I think that if we sort of can open up the ways that they all spark different kinds of relationships and draw from each other, I think that can also make the work more complex.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there have been interesting prejudices. When I was a student, people who made things from molds were kind of looked down upon because they were somehow like not making individualized pieces each time they made it. And I have found like slip casting is pretty remarkable. It's got its own language. It's got its own set of possibilities. And the digital realm is the kind of newer version of that. It's got its own. We're still learning what the possibilities are. We don't know them yet because it's so new.
Right, and we don't need to like freight these with moral value, right? Any particular approach or technique doesn't have to have some kind of moral signposting around it.
Right.
So we have another question from our ceramics program, which is, I think, very practical. What is your advice for how emerging potters can stay productive after leaving school and find success?
I'm going to mute and let Mark take that one to start.
Well, I think Sequoia is a good example of success. I mean, how do you measure success? I think you measure success with what pursuing your interest is. There's not a one size fits all mark to success. I mean, you can become a lifelong studio artist. You could become a teacher. You can become a curator. You can become a writer. You can bounce off of all the skills, and have a very productive and in many ways a very diverse and very fruitful life in ceramics by maybe exposing yourself to all those possibilities. Some people have to just work in the studio. They're driven in that way, but I don't think that's a better outcome than somebody who has tried different things and has moved around and has done, made their career. I think actually, I'm glad as a student, I tried lots of different media because I think it's helped me understand and appreciate things outside of ceramics, whether I bring them into my clay work or not. I just appreciate them as really being important and really being rich. So I don't think everything has to apply to what I do, but I have that appreciation for it. And I think that's what a good art education really does. It opens your eyes to expanding what's out there, what the possibilities are. I hope I didn't dance away from the subject too much, but.
That was good, Mark. I would say in terms of staying productive, I guess I think of productivity obviously can mean a bunch of things. So if the issue is more about staying motivated or staying engaged or interested, then I would seriously consider like doing the thing that keeps you engaged and interested, that you just love doing. So if it feels like you have to force yourself to do ceramics, then I'd maybe think about what your interest is. In terms of staying productive is like having time to dedicate to ceramics, say, after you graduate or finish school. I think the single most important thing is keeping your expenses low, keeping your cost of living low. It's like finding a way to kind of help yourself survive in the world without taking on a lot of encumbrances if you can. I think that's really big. And yeah, I would say those are the two main things.
I've had a few questions that might feed into this a little bit in terms of community, the community of potters, the community of people who exhibit pottery, and how that community might be something that people can plug into. Is there something special about regional clay communities, or how does that all fit in there?
Well, I think the nice thing about clay people I've met is that they're very sharing. And I think I've heard other people in other mediums talk about ceramics in that regard, is that maybe because we're used to working often with other people in the studio, in some medias you don't really need any help, but in ceramics you often have to share a firing, or you need to share, some expense on something. So you're kind of used to working with other people. And I think that's kind of the modern history of studio ceramics. So building a network of people through Instagram or whatever you're comfortable with, or just friendships, is important. And I think that can be a really valuable thing when you're young and trying to find a way in the world. But I have found that, new people moving into areas, and they're trying to contact people. Well, where can I find a place to work? A lot of clay people are very helpful with trying to figure out, like, can we set you up someplace with a friend, or can we, find a community shared space where you could work, is not uncommon. I mean, just one thing I will say about the other question was that I wanted to say is that you have to be passionate about what you want to do, whatever that is, so that you're willing to work as hard as you can at it, because no matter where you go, what aspect you go in, you will have to work very hard. But that's not a bad thing. It's just a reality. And being resourceful, and also just being resilient. And sometimes you can have, some disastrous results in a kiln, and it can be very devastating, and just really, you just have to say, well, I've got to go beyond that, and I'm in it for the long haul in lots of ways, just, keeping that flame alive, especially when you get out of school. And that's where the community thing, I think, is very important. There's so many more opportunities now for people at art centers, community studios, to find a foothold for a while, and that's all you really need for a while to move to the next step.
I would maybe add that clay does have this strong kind of community aspect, and it has historically, just by how the medium works. The sort of equipment heavy aspect of it kind of brings people together to work in clay rather than separately. I think also that this touches on the digital question in terms of digital impact on the field, that we are able now to find our own communities in really, really different ways. And ceramics also is often rural. It has this kind of strong sort of rural background. So people are often isolated or in very kind of sparsely populated communities. And in that sense, having these kind of digital connections is a way to really build out your own community in the way that makes sense to you. It's really a shame that Ayumi's not here to answer this question, because she is such a huge community builder in the ceramics world, and she's like such an inspiration. Her work for sure, but in her way of bringing people together around really important questions in the world with the projects that she does, her Democratic Cup, just lots of them. And so in that sense, I feel like the other way to think about this question for me is around really shifting the understanding of what are the boundaries, I guess, of the clay community. Where are we open and where are we less open? And who feels like they are sort of warmly welcomed into the clay community? And who feels like they have a place in the clay community? I feel like, these questions are really at the forefront. I mean, we can kind of see pretty clearly that the clay community is pretty white. And what does that mean for us? And how do we think about it in more ways, and really shift kind of some of the landscape of that community?
We have a shout from one of our audience members to keep talking about this. This is such a great topic.
Mm-hmm.
Maine does have a pretty interesting and lively community. There may be folks in the audience who are not aware of some of the various facets of it. Mark, would you be able to talk a little bit about some of the big features of the ceramics community here in Maine that people might be able to plug into if they're not already familiar with them?
Right. Well, I mean, Watershed is not very far from Bates. It's maybe an hour's drive at the most, which is a wonderful resource. They just redid their studios, and it's a great residency program, but they also have summer positions for young people to come and work and help the studio work and get great experience meeting lots of people in the summertime. Haystack is similarly located in Maine, which is also a wonderful resource to take a 2-week session or to be a work study helper or get to meet people. So we're kind of lucky that a rather small rural state in many ways has those two world-class opportunities. And Boston has more also because it's urban and has a track record of community-based studios. Mudflat Studio is a great example. So it's not hard to find those opportunities and to kind of join in any way that you can, especially if you're a young person kind of looking to create connections. Those are great places to consider.
Well, great. We have a very museum specific question that's been in the Q&A for quite a while now. So Sequoia, this person's very interested in how you think the changes that are happening to the role of museums. What role do you think that should have in your role as a curator? How much do you want to have that push you, and how much do you want to push against that and help shape it?
I feel like it's a central part of the work is sort of understanding what museums do and kind of what their function is and why they exist. The museums, I think many of us know, like emerged out of princely or elite collections in Europe in the early modern period, so kind of 1500 to 1800, and those, in different places it was different, but they kind of came into the public realm, let's say, sometimes under a lot of contestation and sometimes not. And then in North America, the development of museums in the late 19th century was really about sort of showing wealth and culture. And it was kind of the aggregation of wealth in the United States in particular, Canada too. So they've long had this educational function, of course, and that's why there are so many great college and university museums like the one at Bates. And that's been recognized from very early on, but that sort of educational function started off as really a kind of paternalistic education, this idea of like, oh, let's sort of make the kind of cultural achievement, meaning typically European cultural achievement, in like accessible to the mass population so that they could benefit from it and be uplifted. Of course, museums have long had elite audiences and elite sort of focus. So I think, the real question has been for, the last 40 or 50 years in particular about how to have museums really reflect the communities that they're in and serve the communities that they're in. And folks have been just struggling with this for a long time. And from my point of view, museums are much less elitist than they were, say, in the 70s and 80s, in particular when this kind of idea of new museums kind of started taking hold. But of course, in the last couple of years, particularly in response to the protests of summer of 2020 and the movement for Black Lives, there's this really strong and vibrant conversation and difficult conversation around, why museums are here and why they're the owners of the objects that they have. Of course, there's many angles on it, kind of depending on what sort of institution you are. So sometimes it's a restitution question, right? Like the Elgin marbles or the Benin bronzes, what can we see as sort of temples to culture are also temples to colonialism, let's say. In a case like the Gardner, it's funny because it's a little bit different. As I said, we're a small museum. We don't have a historical tie, particularly to the objects in the collection, the historical objects. So it's not like, say, the Sèvres Museum, for example, outside of Paris, is on the site of the Sèvres manufactory. So it sort of makes sense. On the other hand, we're also not a site of cultural looting. We're on, we're in a kind of settler culture for sure. So that's one aspect of the way that the Gardner kind of occupies its place. But we don't have objects that have been taken by conquest. So what does that mean? Does that mean that we're like, everything's cool and we're all sad? Or does that mean that we still have to look at our questions and our collections critically? And I would say that there's still a lot to be gained from looking at our collections and at our work critically, and to be thinking about sort of who is this museum for, who's welcome for, who is welcome there, who has who sort of leads the conversations around the kind of artwork that we present, the kind of questions that we ask about it, and the kind of folks that we welcome in. Is that an answer? Did I actually answer, or did I just talk around it? I'm not sure.
I think you did. I think it's important to know, museum collections are sort of what you make of them. I mean, they're objects that are there to serve as both wonderful things to look at, but also things to begin conversations. And if you collect stuff and don't use it for productive investigations, it's just sitting around.
Well, I would say that museums use them for productive investigations. The question is like what kinds of, and how many, and what's the range. So I would maybe give two. I'd like to get. I want to be a little more specific because I feel like I was speaking really generally. So I hope it's okay if I just keep talking for a bit. So I want to give two examples. So one has to do with sort of what objects are represented in the collection. What's at the Gardner, for example, and this is an issue at many museums. Like to what extent does the collection represent or reflect the community that the collection is meant to serve? The Gardner's collection is definitely European focused. That's sort of was the kind of founding core of the collection. We do not have super diverse representation, even in our modern and contemporary collection. That's something that we're actively trying to change by collecting more artworks by artists of color. So that's one example. The second example is more on the interpretation model. So for years, the Gardner has had several iterations of a gallery for its 18th century porcelain collection. This is what I showed you with the dining table. The collection is amazing. The scholarship on the collection is amazing. But for years, the collection did not speak to questions of colonialism or slavery or plantation economies. And so much of the elite kind of aristocratic porcelain that was manufactured in Europe in the second half of the 18th century was made like for the objects, for the food and beverages that were coming out of the colonies that were held by Europe. We've decided that this is a really important part of the conversation to have in the museum. So we're starting to integrate it into the interpretation, into the labels and the didactics. So the objects are the same, right? We still have like teapots and coffee pots and chocolate pots, but we're talking about and kind of highlighting their connections to these larger, to colonialism and these larger kind of economic and political developments in the 18th century. For some folks, this feels amazing. And this is like, great, this is exactly what we should be doing. For other folks, they're like, why are you talking about slavery? This is a gallery of 18th century porcelain. Like, we should be talking about porcelain or tea. So there's definitely not consensus on how we ought to interpret these objects.
Well, great. Are there any other questions from the audience? I think the two questions that are in the Q&A have been answered, I'm pretty sure. We've been going at this for about an hour and a half. We've gone through my questions. And so I thank you all for joining us tonight. I thank Mark and Sequoia for your time and all of your great thoughts about all of these questions that people have had. And I'm so sorry that we weren't able to do this in person, but we look forward to being able to again sometime soon. So thank you all, folks.